Just muting yourself and then we'll go ahead. All right, hello and welcome to our program, Confronting Our Inherent Biases, Their Impact on Collections, Research, and Scholarship. My name is Lori Burrell, and I'm Associate Dean for Special Collections at the University of Arkansas. I'm joined today by four fantastic panelists who you'll hear from in just a minute. I wanted to start by providing some context and framing for today's program, and to share a little bit about how we decided to focus on the topic of confronting biases for today's event. As some of you may know, our Special Collections Division has a long history of hosting events during October, known in our profession as Archives Month. The goal behind Archives Month is to highlight the work that we do every day to make collections available for research. However, we've typically erred on the side of sharing projects and aspects of our profession that are points of pride, rather than offering our audiences a critical reflection on how we as archivists are situated within that work. Today's program is a first attempt at such a critical reflection. In the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, and as I watched the ensuing peaceful protests, I felt completely helpless and trapped this past summer. This was due in part to the impact of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but mostly due to the uncomfortable questions that these events raised for me. As a person who is white, cisgender, and an administrator at a university, I enjoy tremendous power and privilege. But have I ever used my positionality to address the systemic racism in our society? I found myself turning inward and considering where I was in my journey to become anti-racist. This journey isn't something I'll be rewarded for, nor should it be, and it's my sole responsibility. As I continued to confront the lessons of my upbringing and my own white fragility, I found myself taking note of how others in the world of academia were responding to these national events. Here in Arkansas, questions about Confederate monuments and other depictions of Confederate soldiers became the focus of discussion on our Arkansas History listserv. As participants posed more and more questions about our own state's history, I found myself wanting more and more to take some kind of action. I've become tired of statements and committees. I really wanted to do something. Fostering an anti-racist society is a monumental task, and I quickly felt defeated. That feeling of defeat is what keeps those of us in positions of white privilege silent, and that is unacceptable. But how do we push through the silence? What can we in archives do to foster an anti-racist society? What responsibility do we have in cultural heritage institutions, which are inherently places of great privilege, to contribute to such work? And how do the intersectionalities of our experiences impact the work that can and should be done? It was in one of my weekly meetings with one of our faculty members in special collections and one of today's panelists, Joshua Youngblood, that we started to talk about what we could do, what actions we could take. We started small and took down a portrait of Albert Pike, a senior officer in the Confederate State Army and later an assumed member of the Klan here in Arkansas. That portrait had been hanging in the entryway of our division for decades. By keeping that portrait on the wall, we're sending a message, however subtle, about the kinds of stories we're interested in and who we most want to hear from. We need to send a different message, and one that creates a space and program that fosters the kind of inclusivity we want to create. But then the question arose, what archival object should go up in its place? And who decides? And how does that person's inherent biases impact that decision? And where does that archival material come from? And how did that object come to be in the collection? And who made those decisions? There are an infinite number of questions. Joshua and I decided to plan a program that would expose more questions and push us to think more critically about our roles as stewards of cultural heritage. Today's program is a result of that series of informal conversations we had this summer, and it's but one piece in my journey to interrogate and reflect on the role I play within our profession. We certainly know that we're not the only ones at the University of Arkansas or in our profession or in the public who want to engage in such critical reflection. The other events that our division has hosted or co-hosted this semester provided a space for a number of our graduate students on campus to engage with such questions through primary resources. Supporting graduate students is one of the key areas of focus for our division. We continued our graduate student speaker series with an analysis of women who paid and planned for the former Confederate monument in the Bentonville Town Square. We heard from 3 former speakers in that graduate student speaker series who shared their research about the history of the Arkansas state flag and its Confederate iconography. And in our final event of the semester next month, we'll be hearing from a graduate student in the School of Art who will share with us how archival objects inform her printmaking work focused around climate change and landscape. We intend to continue this critical reflection in future semesters, and we hope you'll continue to engage with us. We appreciate you taking the time to come to today's program. This virtual event gives us an opportunity to hear from those of us who work nearby, as well as to draw on the expertise of those who work further afield. I'm grateful for the time each of our panelists have given, and we all look forward to engaging with you, our participants. Before I turn things over to our panelists, there are a few housekeeping items. We've turned off the microphone and video features today in Zoom for you, our participants. However, we do want to hear from you, and we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A button, which we'll be monitoring throughout the talk and which we hope to respond to at the end of today's program. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor for this event, the University of Arkansas's Office for Diversity and Inclusion. I'd also like to thank our administrative assistant, Dina Owens, who managed the registration for our event and who is monitoring the chat today, as well as our library's Director of Public Relations who promoted today's event, Kelsey Lippard. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists who will offer introductory remarks as well as providing you with some background about themselves and how they come to this work. And so we'll be starting with Celestia Johnson, so I'll invite you to unmute yourself. And what I'm hoping you'll share with us a bit is how you're bringing a social justice framework to your collecting work at Princeton University, and specifically your efforts to document the student experience there. How do you create a safe space for students to engage in archiving, which historically has been something accessible only to privileged white males?
Thank you, Lori. So my name is Celestia Johnson. I'm the archivist for student life at Princeton University, and I come to my work with the intention of valuing the human more than the collection and the material that they create, and coming with that intentionality that I'm not here to extract from them, but I'm here to be of a service and a resource for the students. So that's going beyond acquisition, but teaching them how to manage their own records and helping be a support as they build their own repositories for themselves first, because collections should be of use and not just something to point towards when we get questions of like, well, do you have diverse voices in your collection? And I interact with students in a variety of different ways. First, as donors, which is different and unique than any other position on campus. And I try to make sure that whenever we have these donor interactions, that they have that's informed consent. So I tell them the power that they have and what they can ask for and what they should be asking when they interact with repositories. And I'm honest and transparent about what we can do to safeguard their privacy and who has access and when they have access to them. And a use case for this is that a lot of students, because how they matriculate so fast, students as a populace lose their institutional memory a lot. And sometimes they have to start from the ground up again, even though there's been student groups and activism in the past that has traveled down the same road. And so the students in 2019 were really asking of examples of student activism throughout Princeton, and they were coming from different sectors of different groups. And so myself, along with my partner Amanda Ferrara, decided to do some of the research for them and to create a data set that they can pull from and get a jumping off point so they can explore deeper. And through that outreach program, we got connected organically to the student leaders, and then we got to talk to them about, well, what is the work of an archivist? What do we do? How can we intersect with student records? How can we help be of service and provide the same infrastructure that we provide the university administration and the departments? And we start having really in-depth donor conversations about, well, if I do deposit my activist material here, how are you going to safeguard me from the surveillance of the university and others who would want to keep track of them? And so I think that's how I create a safe space, by being open and honest, and again, by treating the student and the creator as a human being and concerned with how they are treated right now, not just how their records will be treated in the future.
Great, thank you. And I think that based on what Valencia is sharing, it kind of underscores that we can't really change our collecting focus on a dime, that this is long-term work that really relies on collection development and building relationships with our donors, whoever they may be. So I think with that, I'll turn to Joshua Youngblood and ask him to sort of reflect on what we've just heard and to share his own experiences with collection development here at the University of Arkansas, and how our own interests as archivists, our own inherent biases, and those of our donors, of course, and those of our dealers who we work with, how does that then impact the kinds of materials and collections that we're making available to our researchers?
All right. Well, thank you, Lori, for hosting us all, and thank you, Valencia, for this great opening. And it is it's inspiring to hear the work that you're doing with your students. A little bit of background about me. I've been at the U of A Special Collections now for 9 years, and I've had the opportunity to do a lot of different jobs there. As people always say when they introduce me here, he wears lots of hats. I know that's true of all of us, but they actually, all my hats actually reflect on the comments that I want to provide today in the conversation, or what I can bring to it. So when I started here, I was the Research and Outreach Services Librarian, where I was running our Research Services unit, meeting with and helping researchers across the state, working with remote patrons, international patrons in our case, with some of our collections, but also helping build an instruction program, kind of rebuild an instruction program and try to reach out across the campus and meet students, meet faculty, find ways that our archives could meet the students where they are, could meet teaching needs, as well as continue to anticipate and enhance faculty research that was happening on campus. Since then, I've gone on to become the head of what we call our instruction and outreach unit now, which encompasses a lot of that work, but also includes more of a focus on instruction, more of a focus on student need, working with graduate students as well as undergraduates, and developing bridges and liaison relationships with different programs across campus. I'm also the Rare Books in Arkansas collection curator here, and I'm the history librarian. So I have the opportunity to meet with students and researchers at all levels in lots of different ways. And hearing what Valencia's doing at Princeton, I'm reminded of some of the successes we've had here at the U of A, but also some of the limitations we've had because of our history of collection development over the years, and just what we have and who's represented, including our students. As I've reflected on this conversation today, I'm reminded of this quote. It's a quote actually used, so I'll have to provide a citation to myself, as I would tell my students. You have to cite your own work. It's a presentation I gave several years ago, but I was talking actually about getting civil rights materials and empowering civil rights materials to undergraduate students. That was my focus for that talk, and tying that to university mission. And the quote actually comes from an Arkansas folklorist named Mary Parler. And she was visiting Southern Arkansas. She was actually doing field recordings at an African-American Baptist church in Southern Arkansas. So she went all the way from the Ozarks up in Fayetteville down to Southern Arkansas, about 6 hours away. And she was doing a recording. And she opens the recording by saying, I'm here from the university to let all of you know that the university is yours too. And when we are capturing stories and recording people, we want you to be in those collections. So that recording was from the early 1950s. And one of the things that I've continued to reflect upon about that idea, and really that mission, that charge from Mary Parler, is ways we haven't accomplished it yet, ways we weren't doing it. Her own project, which was heavily biased towards Anglo-Saxon background songcraft in the Ozarks, with only, I can remember it exactly, 118 African-American voices included in a project of thousands of recordings. So that challenge is still there. Our collections here at Special Collections, we started our division in 1967, so we're 53 years old. We're, I like to make the joke, we're approaching middle age now, so now we have to be critical and figure out what we're doing, where we're going now. But those collections that were brought into our special collections date back actually almost to the very founding of our university in 1871. Rare Books holdings, Arkansas collection holdings, our first major manuscript and Arkansas history collection came from a former governor, which was all focused on Arkansiana. And our major collections have always been focused on our strengths. So when our division was finally formalized in 1967, one of the reasons it was formalized because we were about to get the J. William Fulbright papers. We knew that Senator Fulbright's papers had to go somewhere. So thinking about what we do really well or the strengths in our collections, and I know a lot of archivists have to think about this, and as a teaching archivist, I have to look at what I have and how can I get things to students. We have great strengths in political papers. We have great strengths in Arkansas history. We also have some highlights from Arkansas history that we try to use to meet a lot of people's needs, including people of color, including marginalized groups. So we're very strong in Arkansas Civil War history. We're also really strong in civil rights history. And we try to make our collections work as best we can. Getting back to what Valencia was saying about her work with the students, we've just recently had a university archives founded. Actually, the University Archives has been founded in the last decade since I've been here. And our outreach to students is kind of slow still, although our university archivist does a really wonderful job. Instead, what our university archives represents mostly is similar to what our legacy collections and our 50 years of collecting reflect, which are the interests of researchers on campus, people's preconceived or the predominant understanding of what Arkansas history is, what our researchers, faculty, and maybe even students at times, what those people think are the most important things to be there. And I think that most important is a really big idea for us as archivists to think about. Who decides what's important? And so even though we have some amazing collections, they always reflect this inherent bias. And so we have multiple facets of an inherent bias we have to grapple with here in our department or our division, just like they do, special collections do all over the country. We have our strengths, the things we've done well, which meant that we miss other things. We also have the bias of great professionals we've had over the decades. And something I'm still coming to terms with is that in in our state, 53-year-old special collections, we have never had a full-time faculty member or staff member here who's a person of color in 53 years. So that's clearly a challenge. Now, we've had incredible people that have brought their own interests here. So we have amazing collections that relate to women's history and suffrage in Arkansas. We have amazing collections that relate to home administration clubs and women's agency and economic development. We have incredible collections that relate to really important stories from the civil rights era, like we have the Daisy Bates papers here. But those tend to be really important collections that we thought we had to bring in and not representing everybody in our state. And so as I have over the years found ways to leverage our collections into teaching opportunity, design outreach programming around what we have to represent the state, I find myself making our collections do a lot of work, for one thing, but also recognizing some gaps there, some things that we just haven't done. And so going forward, we have to look at our successes, but we also have to think, who are the members of our community? Who are the members of our constituency? Who are the people that we really want to use our collections? And for me, something I think about a lot, who are the people we really want to be empowered by our collections? Who are those people that need to have their story and their narrative available or something that they could draw on for inspiration? How do we build new relationships to get to those people? Now that I'm Arkansas collection curator and I've been doing that work for a long time and working closely with everyone in our division, I have to look at our collection development in a slightly different way. But I think it's part of something we're doing, which I'm really glad about, is we're doing critical self-assessment of what we've done in the past. So this is stuff we've done really well. Going forward, how are we going to rely on the really great relationships we have with donors in the past, but how are we going to forge new relationships going forward? So among other things, we're thinking about how we can really get on board or embrace community archiving projects. So partnering with other organizations to help them do archiving and not just think about, oh, it'll come up to the hill. Eventually you will have your materials up in Fayetteville with us. No, we want to be out in the community helping people recognize the importance of their own stories. I think we're also trying to get away from which, to bluntly put it, is the big white guy or the big important story of history. We're trying to get away from that. So as proud as I am here to have the Senator Dale Bumpers papers or the Senator J. William Fulbright papers. There's so many other people that need to be represented here. Part of having a political papers bias in Arkansas doesn't have a lot of politicians who are people of color. So if that's our collecting strength, those people are not going to be in our collections. That's something we have to think about. And as I wrap things up here with my opening remarks, I would like to touch on something that happened on our campus, speaking of being inspired and empowered over the summer, which was our Black at UARK student-led movement. And I know a lot of campuses have experienced this challenge from their students in recent years. And we definitely were challenged by it ourselves here. And the Black at UARK, which was a hashtag on Twitter, was a student-led conversation inspired by George Floyd, part of the momentum of other conversations happening over the summer. But here at the U of A, we were challenged on icons, including Fulbright, whose papers we so proudly have here, and whose statue that's the center of our campus, and but students were telling us, he was a segregationist. How is this the icon for us? And as an archivist, I try to stay objective on those issues, of course, but listening to students, listening to faculty and researchers, and stepping back and saying, okay, not only what is the leading edge of research, but what is the leading edge of this cultural moment? What's the conversation that they are pushing us towards? That's something that I think we are starting to really embrace in our special collections, is how do we take that inspiration and that push from other people and turn that into our strategic development? How are we going to be strategic about meeting future community and constituent needs? So thank you.
Great, Joshua, thank you. So that's a good opportunity to bring Stace, to bring you into the conversation and your background, which is a little bit different. You work in a museum, of course. I'm curious to hear a little bit from you. I know that you've shared with us before about how you really try to bring the whole history of works of art out through the museum interpretation, exhibit interpretation that you do. So curious to just hear a little bit about that work and how you're really trying to unearth some of these histories in your work with the public.
Yeah, thanks, Lori, and the whole panel. I'm very happy to be here today. When I first learned this was about archives, I'm like, well, I'm probably not your guy. But actually, my background actually comes from communication. I don't have an art history background. I don't have an art background per se, other than loving it and enjoying museums and those kinds of institutions. I was in the academy for quite some time, teaching in the realm of communication studies and media and cultural studies. And so a lot of that work also involved doing, at the time, critical thinking and what I consider to have been anti-racist work in the classroom in terms of getting people to think about modes of representations, historical inaccuracies, if you will, and sort of the dearth of voices from the past that oftentimes we struggle with. I think Dr. Charisse Jones-Branch is going to tell us some stuff about that in a few minutes. So stay tuned. But in the art context, of course, I work for Crystal Bridges. Crystal Bridges opened in 2011, so we're about 9 years old. I've been with the institution for 5 years. And in that time, one of the things that I've learned is that one of our big goals in our mission is to welcome all to the museum. And that means we want all people to feel welcome there, to experience the power of art. But, a lot of times those can be kind of lofty and relatively empty words if you don't really understand who your audiences are or what barriers that there may be for audiences to even show up. It's kind of considered a quote unquote high culture institution. Dealing in fine art. And for a lot of people, that immediately means, well, that's not for me. That's for, whomever the collectors. The museum, of course, was founded, as most people know, by Alice Walton and the Walton family, a generous donation, philanthropic gift. But it really kind of started with like a base collection that had been led by Alice and some of her education and background. And what it reflected really was just the traditional canon of American art. And so one of the first points I want to make about doing what we call anti-racism work is addressing the canon. And all of our disciplines in different ways have canons, which are the kind of expected accepted kind of top of the chain examples of fine art in the country. And as we know, pretty much until fairly recently, in quite last few decades, the majority of those people in the canon have been the white straight male. And so there's this whole tradition, and there's also this whole history in terms of collecting, who donates, the major donors to museums and things like that, that get really fraught. So how are we going to be open and accessible to all if we don't start confronting some of the things that need to be confronted? So we've got a lot of historic art in our collection. We have about 3 galleries full of it, large majority straight white male. So one of our challenges has really been to how do you address that complicated history in a way that allows people to have access in some way to a broader context in which that art was made, rather than just sort of thinking, oh, the artist was doing this and was here or there, this is what their influences were. My question a lot of times with interpretation is, well, what are the larger historical contexts that were informing that particular position or that particular viewpoint as expressed through the art? And so a lot of what we've been doing in recent years at Crystal Bridges is in our education programs and everything is starting to raise questions around, okay, so this was a period in our history where, number one, there were large millions of people enslaved, literally owned, considered as property. There were a million others who were being forcibly removed from their land and experiencing genocidal treatment at the hands of the US government. And so these stories that comprise our American art story, a lot of it was fueled by the art itself as a kind of propaganda. So, these kinds of stories are some that we have to be able to tell and we have to be able to express and invite people to come in and ask the questions that are hard and fair. We also have a collecting strategy for our collections in terms of increasing the number of representational artists in the collection, particularly BIPOC. We've also have, I think, 4 or 5 persons of color on our curatorial staff who actually make decisions on what we're bringing in. And we've added board members, at least 2 board members in the last couple of years who are people of color who we never had before. So there's still a long way to go. There are a lot of things that we need to do structurally throughout the institution, but also just reaching out to our community and see what it is that they need from a cultural institution, right? And rather than it just being about, for example, one of the things we're asking is, what is American art? Where does it start, right? Who does it include? Is it just the United States of America? So, there's a lot of things that we do. We are openly questioning and thinking about in terms of what does a 21st century American art museum look like and what does it need to look like? So these are some of the questions we do with exhibition development. A lot of times we've done some recent exhibitions around Black art in America, Indigenous contemporary art, border issues through the lens of 2 artists in an exhibition called Border Cantos a couple of years ago. And these are where we did invite members of the community and different members that are impacted by those issues to help us think through the development of these exhibitions and to help in many ways co-create and imagine what this exhibition, these would mean. And that's a really important process for us in terms of exhibition development now, is that we always do consider what is the subject, what is the topic, what are the contexts, and whose voices need to be at the table to create the work. So those are a few of the things that we do. So.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll certainly want to hear more as we continue with the program today. So I think at this point, I'll turn things over to our 4th panelist, Dr. Jones Branch, and we've heard a lot so far this afternoon about whether it's archiving in place or supporting, student organizations, whether they're going to donate or continue to maintain their own records. We've heard about kind of institutional histories with collecting, and we've of course heard about the very important work and kind of critical reflection that Crystal Bridges is doing with their collecting. And so I'm curious now to hear from you about your recent, your not so much recent, but your scholarship in terms of unearthing some of these hidden histories that maybe one day may wind up in an archive or not, and how you're going about that in terms of producing the scholarship that you've been doing.
Thank you, and to my fellow panelists, and thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm Sharice Jones Branch. I'm the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Professor of History at Arkansas State University. And more recently, I'm now an administrator. I'm Dean of the graduate school at this fine institution. But as of late, I've really been working on rural Black women's history in Arkansas. And the result of that is going to be my forthcoming book, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas, 1914 to 1965, which is going to be published by the University of Arkansas Press in 2021. And in doing the research for that book, one of the things that occurred to me when I started doing this research was we hear some things about rural history and women in rural spaces in particular, but we don't really hear about Black women. We hear about them in the context of them being, agricultural laborers, but those narratives haven't really ever been complicated. And so I actually started by doing a very simple paper at a symposium that John Kirk had at UALR a few years ago on African-American home demonstration agents. And that started from a place where a colleague had done some work on home demonstration agents. And I wondered what that experience was like for Black women. And essentially, upon being told that Black and white women were having the same experience, I thought that just couldn't be accurate, certainly not in the context of the rural Jim Crow South. And so I started digging, and what I found was their experiences were similar on the surface, but in terms of their very real lived experiences from day to day, they were very different. And I only meant for that to be a one-time conference paper, but the project took on a life of its own, and I started adding other stories to the mix. So it's the home demonstration agents, Jean's supervisor teachers, the Arkansas Association of Colored Women, on and on and on. The big question, of course, was where do you locate those sources? Because they're just difficult to find. I knew, thanks to Joshua Youngblood, that there was information on home demonstration agents at the University of Arkansas, but I believe there's exactly one file that deals with African-American home demonstration agents, which he so very graciously sent to me, so I didn't have to drive to Fayetteville to get it. But in order to really flesh out the story of these home demonstration agents and these other Black women activists, I really had to go digging. I really had to go excavating to find these resources, because nobody had really ever written about them anywhere in any state. So I had to start digging. They're not just sitting in an archives in Arkansas. And so I really had to think deeply about the story of rural women and what was there, but also what was missing from that story about these Black women. And I had to ask questions that people hadn't thought to ask. Yes, some of them are agricultural laborers, sharecroppers, or whatever, but is that all there was to their lives? And what I discovered, and what I sort of inherently knew anyway, was that no, their work is not who they are. Their work was not their lives. And so I started looking beyond their agricultural labor and looking at other parts of their lives. And so, for instance, in looking at some of these rural Black women, I had to look at the file that Josh sent me, but then I also had to travel to other places to find out what home demonstration agents were doing in Arkansas, and what are they talking about in their meetings? What are they talking about with Black people in these rural spaces? And the example that I've used many, many times before is when people think about home demonstration agents and home demonstration clubs, everybody has, I don't know, a memory of their grandma or somebody being in one of these clubs, and they're always talking about canning tomatoes. And as I've said before, canning tomatoes ain't all that interesting. So what other kinds of conversations are happening in the midst of all of that? And what I found very quickly is they're talking about all kinds of things. Rurality doesn't equal ignorance. right? The lack of formal education doesn't mean that you aren't having intelligent discussions. And it's not just that home demonstration agents were going into these communities and helping Black people. Black people were requesting them and making very special kinds of demands of them, and actually saying that if you can't provide us with this, then why do we need you? So that's very different from the narrative that we typically hear about rural people, wherein people go in there and they help them. I see more commonly a situation where they are forming partnerships with people who are already living in these spaces. So that's a different way of reading the record and reading it through a different lens that gets you to a very different story about what's happening in those spaces. And so I thought it was really, really important to elevate those stories, to dig into the Extension Service records, and to discover things like in these meetings, they're talking about paying poll taxes. Some people would argue that rural Black people who are sharecroppers are not concerned about taxes. That's not, that's voting rather. That's not true. They're having discussions about paying poll taxes. In the post-World War II years, they're talking about things like the United Nations. They're having discussions that we would typically assume that rural Black people and rural Black women in particular aren't having, but the evidence is right there. We're also talking about Black women who are talking to political officials and using their limited power to say, here are some of the things that we need in the community. We assume that unless you are middle upper class and or white, you're not having those kind of discussions with people. That's not true. And the evidence in the records bears all of that out. But we haven't really looked at it in that way because the narrative, again, when it comes to rural Black people, has been largely limited to one of oppression. And of course, that's true, but that's not the only truth in terms of these people's lives. And so when you come at it from that perspective and knowing that their lives are more nuanced and complicated than what we thought, or rather what we've been taught, then you have all kinds of other questions that come out of that. And you start searching in all kinds of interesting places. So, case in point, when we talk about the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation, nobody thinks that Black people are members, and certainly nobody thinks that Black women are members, but I can prove to you that they were in fact members. Right? But we think about this organization in a particular way, we're not looking for certain kinds of stories. So for me, it has been a matter of me looking at the sources rather than saying, well, they're not going to be in this collection, so we're not going to mess with it. Take a look at the collection. They may very well show up. There may not be tons of information on them, but there's almost always some information. And the other thing that really guided my research was thinking outside of the archives and not assuming that I would go to an archives and find a collection about these rural Black women, look at a finding aid and say, I just want this file out of this box, whatever. I had to be a bit more creative and innovative than that because many of these women, their records are in their homes. They're in barns, they're in big rubber tins, they're in back closets, they're in places like that. So in terms of doing research, you have to think about it differently. I can't just walk into an archives. I have to form relationships with people. And I talk about this a little bit in the last chapter of my book about a rural Black woman landowner who's still very much alive today. I couldn't just show up at her house to get all this information. I had to form a relationship with her. And more importantly, she had to make sure I wasn't crazy. I mean, and I do mean that very seriously because you're inviting a stranger into your house. You have to make sure that that person has good and honest intentions. That person won't harm you in some way. These are not things that researchers typically have to think about when they're going into the archives. And so I also had to have other things that made me comfortable for this individual, right? So it mattered that I was a member of certain kinds of organizations that she was a member of. And once they determined that I was a fairly safe person, I was allowed to come and talk to this woman, and she gave me free and unfettered access to documents that she had collected over decades. That include things like her very strong involvement in the Arkansas Republican Party, her membership again in the Arkansas Farm Bureau Federation, her appointment to the USDA Civil Rights Commission, all kinds of things that are not in archives in Arkansas. All of these things are located in her house. So in terms of thinking about the stories we hear and the people who are excluded from those stories, what I'm finding and what I have found is that they are almost always part of those stories. It's just that their resources, just because of the way certain kinds of archival resources have been privileged, they haven't made it to the archives, but they are located somewhere. So what that requires us to do, what it required me to do, was to think outside of that physical space to all the other spaces where those sources were located. And that is what allowed me to put this book together.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so my next question is open for any of the four of you to respond to. Thinking about each of your roles, how can we best advocate to stakeholders as we work to combat the systemic and structural institutional histories that all of our institutions possess as part of our efforts to create environments where knowledge can truly become more democratized?
Well, I would say that one of the biggest things is that there needs to be more less talking on one side and more listening on the other. And one of the things about active listening, as opposed, listening to understand rather than listening to reply, is that you must certainly be willing to act on the answers to the questions you might ask. So, for example, it might be very uncomfortable for some cultural institutions in many ways to learn, about, we'll say, implicit biases and other things like that. It's just fundamental, though, to find the humility to just, first of all, stop and listen. I'll give you an example. One of the things that Crystal Bridges is trying to do, and it's a process. We're in the process of it. It's ongoing. Is in opening that story of American art is to include Indigenous people in that process, and yet our very institutionality is a deep offense to most Indigenous peoples. Due to the colonizing history of museums. And so that requires ongoing building relationships of trust that could take several years or decades. But it's being committed, I think, to that work. And it's also in valuing different kinds of knowledge. I mean, Dr. Jones Branch, of its story of it took her thinking outside of the box, literally, to think about where else would this material be, and moving from a model of collecting material to more of an affective process, that relationship building, and valuing the knowledges that come from that. It's a very different kind of model, I think.
Yes, Valencia, please go ahead.
I think adding to that, being an active listener, also you have to re-examine your past and your past communications with the communities that you now want to interact with. I think a lot of times cultural heritage institutions get into these or want to engage in these conversations without acknowledging the past harm that they've done. And you have to do that, because if you're coming into the conversation thinking that you haven't done anything and that the slate is clean, then you're going to actually ignore my experience, and we're not meeting at the same time, and we're not going to reach the same goals of the conversation. And also just re-examine what you have. A lot of times, as Dr. Jones Branch said, stories are in here. People of color, marginalized communities are a part of your history. It's whether or not your institution has acknowledged it. Where have you glossed over them? Where have you buried them? Princeton is 274 years old. But when you think of Princeton, you think of white, male, and privilege. But people of color and people from different backgrounds have been a part of Princeton's history since it began. And part of the work that the University Archives is doing, largely April Armstrong, is pulling those stories out and telling people, hey, our history is a little more complex than that. There were women in the graduate school before Princeton went co-ed in 1969. There were Black students who were interacting with Princeton before Princeton officially integrated in the mid-1940s. And by doing that, you can show people where they intersect with your institution so they can see themselves in the record and see themselves in the history. And then maybe because of that, they can see themselves as a space that they can inhabit and that they can transform and own as they continue to interact with you.
Great, thank you.
I also just want to add to that by saying, again, we always have to challenge our assumptions. You know, if we assume that certain sorts of people aren't going to show up, then we're probably going to be very wrong about that. I found that to be true time and time again. And again, I just want to underscore the point that relationship building is important. You're not coming at this with a clean slate, but on the other side of that, because of historical relationships or the lack thereof, or inequitable relationships or whatever, they may not have any reason to trust you. All right, so everybody can't access the same space and the same materials in the same way. I know that I can access certain kinds of information and certain kinds of resources simply because of who I am. And that has just borne itself out to be true time and time again. I know that if it was anybody else, certain kinds of doors would immediately be closed. All right, and that's just a reality. And in terms of, like, you know, politics in Arkansas, we never really talk about Blacks in politics in Arkansas. And there's a very, very long history of that, going all the way back almost to the founding of the state. And nobody really knows about that. But if you look at newspaper articles, for example, in the Arkansas Gazette, a mainstream newspaper in this state, and you look at the late 19th century, they're talking about Black political activism. So those stories are there. But if we don't think of certain people as being involved or being a part of certain kinds of stories, it won't occur to us to look. So we always have to be thinking about the fact that these people were probably there rather than just assuming they weren't there. Because when you assume that, you won't look. And then you miss very important stories and, again, very important complexities and nuances.
Yeah, I would just like to reinforce and agree with what all the other panelists have said. You know, part of I think part of, for me anyway, and I think it's really important to do this, is to celebrate and help support the creative and new ways that people are using your archives. So it seems like a simple thing, but when people bring new paradigms and new understandings to what is there, like the work of Dr. Jones Branch and others, make sure that people know about that and know about the other narratives that are present. And an important part of that from our standpoint on the archivist and librarian side of that is learning from that and then helping future discovery. So whether that is correcting metadata, whether that is looking at new ways of creating new discovery platforms, new entry points, rethinking our finding aids, bring a new vocabulary to it, or come up with new ways to teach it. For me, something I'm always thinking about is how to take the lessons I learned from the new book, the new journal article, the great new talk I just went to, and how am I going to present this material differently now that I know more about it. And part of that is actually relates to something that Stace said about what we think of as the canon, the celebrated or the accepted truth about that. As an archivist, just accepting that I don't know the answers. And I really don't know the right way to do a lot of things. I know a lot about what I do, but I don't know everything else. So being really open to new information, new ways of looking at it. And then to pick up on something Valencia said, accepting critical correction and challenges when they're offered. I think it's really important for us, especially as quote unquote gatekeepers of information. We really have to be open and actually, you know, not defensive at all, just like, oh, this is a new criticism that we are receiving. That's really important. How can we then change the way we do it? And being open to that critical assessment from the outside also means seeking input and really building relationships, being focused on building not just strong relationships, but new relationships. And, you know, if that means coming up with an advisory panel, if that means before, like in my case, doing rare books acquisition and Arkansas collection acquisition, going and asking someone else that just knows different stuff than I do and say, do we have the material? Do you have recommendations? Does this thing make sense to you? Yeah.
Great. Well, now I think, it's a good time to open things up to our audience. We've gotten a number of questions. The first one I'm going to offer to our panelists is actually one that got emailed earlier today by someone who wasn't able to be here. But her question is, are you familiar with the concept of rematriation? I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. Do you think items created by Indigenous people taken by illicit means, however long ago, should be returned to their descendants? And I'll open this up to any of our panelists. Go ahead, Stace.
Being in the museum field, this is a hot topic. In my personal opinion is absolutely yes, if they request it and they want it. One of the things that is, of course, a reality is that we'll just say from the Indigenous American perspective, there are many tribes and nations who, if receive the material back, may not necessarily have storage facilities that can adequately take care of it. So what happens in those cases is a lot of times they will make there'll be reparations where the ownership of the material is granted back to the originating people, but yet then there will be an arrangement where the museum will care for it in their collection in perpetuity, right? So in other words, they would take care of it, maintain the maintenance of the material, but they can never show it unless they have express permission from the people. And there are many things that are in museums now that are just absolutely sacred that should never be there. They should have never been taken. And that's just a continual legacy. That's one of the problems with a lot of Indigenous people not trusting any museum, period. Unless they formed their own. But I do think that, you're going to hear a lot of things about that. I mean, we're even continuing to find art that's been, the Nazis looted, for example, from Jewish families and others. It's a hot button issue, and that raises, the questions of these relationships between art and the market and the amount of money that's in the market. I won't even touch on that at the moment. But in terms of the Indigenous question, I think personally that it's theirs.
Great, thank you. So one of the questions we've gotten is for you, Valencia. And when you were talking about the comments you've gotten from students about protecting them from surveillance, can you talk a little bit about your response to that in terms of what, if any, kinds of protections that you offer or talk about? And then also the second part of the question is, after materials are donated, are they accessible and open for research?
So in terms of the surveillance and the privacy, that came from an activist group that's active right now and trying to push for change on campus. And we concluded the conversation saying, right now is not a good time to donate to the university archives because we can't guarantee that. And that's okay. It is okay to tell your potential donor that actually we can't do that. Maybe we should hold off and come back later. Because again, I'm concerned about the person first and foremost than just us getting material. And a lot of people are concerned about their privacy and who will have access to what, because Special Collections is equal and open access library. You don't have to have affiliation with the university to come and use our collections. There are donor restrictions and administrative restrictions on our collections, but we don't go, but those are blanket. So I can look in the ACLU records as long as they're not closed due to the stated restrictions that are also on our finding aids. So it's public knowledge. And we talked a little bit more about like how people can access it, whether they're going to be remote or in person, the time limit for it as well. So it's kind of those conversations.
Great, thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions about institutional pushback, about some of the critical questions and types of reflection we've talked about today. So just kind of opening this up to anyone, what are some suggestions you might have, or someone asked about specific kind of communication tools or talking points? And the other piece of the question was also about where do we see this potential pushback coming from? Are there particular stakeholders or constituents who were likely to push back about on some of this?
Well, I'm happy to offer some comments. And one of my colleagues who has to, in all honesty, deal with more of the pushback than I would is on this call with me, Dr. Burrell. But I think that institutional messaging and institutional pushback is a concern. I know for us, Arkansas is a diverse place, and people have they have a strong sense of ownership of the place, but also of the content of our collections and messaging. And it's not just here at the University of Arkansas, that's across our state. People really feel like they own the history, and they want the institutions to reflect certain parts of the story. We have at the University of Arkansas Special Collections, we have been caught up in controversy before. And it happens lots of places where people either don't agree with an interpretation that's coming out, or they think that we are obfuscating or hiding information, or they think that we're part and parcel of some other agenda or some other subversive narrative. Of course, I would say that we're not doing any of that intentionally. But I think one of the challenges for us is knowing that the advocacy, and this something that Valencia just said of being honest with your donors is just so important. And I want to pick that up a little bit. Part of advocacy is both internal and external advocacy, being honest, sticking to your ethics, but also explaining your ethics and the protocols that you're adhering to in a very transparent way, to say these are our concerns, this is what we can do, these are our priorities. But I think that also extends to donor relations, who we're speaking with, and what our priorities are. As much as I wish our special collections had infinite size and infinite resources, we don't. So we have to be selective. That also means that internally and within our libraries and across the campus, we have to have conversations about what are the things we're prioritizing? Where are we going to put our energy? And we also have to be really straightforward about why that is. But part of that internal advocacy, I think also is reminding people, or maybe as archivists, taking the opportunity to teach people what's the purpose of our institution. So we're a records holding institution. We collect history, we collect memories, we collect documents. We're facilitating learning, we're facilitating people creating their own narratives, and we're fostering better social and cultural understanding. That's what we do. We don't collect things, we don't just highlight things, and we don't erect monuments. What we do is we provide people an opportunity and the resources they need to learn. And that means that we have to challenge ourselves, and we have to sometimes pick our battles, but we also have to explain that this is why we are prioritizing these decisions. This is why we think this description or this donor relation or this opportunity is so important. And then just make the case. And it takes a long time, but make the case to the institution, but also our constituents, stakeholders, in our case, across the state, and in some cases, well, across the United States, explain to them, this is what we want to do. We want your help to do it. And we're really working to get right.
Great. So Dr. Jones-Branch, we've gotten a couple questions for you, both in your role as a researcher and also your role as an educator and teacher. So thinking about your own research experience in archives, how have different archival descriptions, whether we're talking about finding aids, catalog records, how have those records helped or hinder your research, and how can we as archivists do better? And then the flip of that question from another participant is, how do we help our students to become more critical readers of the archive?
Well, I'll respond to the first question. In some instances, interestingly enough, knowing that there's a colored file helps a lot, right? Because that's something you can just go to almost immediately, and you know that information is dealing with Black people in some way, shape, or form. But that's not where it should stop, right? And that's not what I did in my research. I looked at that file, and great, I have that information, but I also looked through everything else, because a lot of times people's names are just sort of splattered in different places intermittently. Case in point is when I talk about Annie Zachary Pike, and in the Arkansas Republican Party papers, I think she only comes up maybe twice. but I had to know the name. So I had to go into the archives with a certain kind of knowledge to know what I was looking for. And I found her name. And then I found, this one document that was actually from her campaign when she ran for the Arkansas State Senate in 1972. And I just kept looking for references to this woman or references to African Americans in the Republican Party. So it would help if those things were clearer, but just because of my training and because I knew how records were likely to be set up when it came to certain kinds of people, I knew that just accepting this sort of lump information in one place wasn't sufficient. I had to keep combing through the sources, and I had to keep digging until I could find what I needed, or at least piece together the story that I needed to. But I mean, I think doing a deeper dive into the kinds of things that are available in the record and thinking, I think there's something you said, Joshua, about thinking about the kind of language we use to describe what's in files could be more diverse. Because if you say certain kinds of things, it doesn't trigger people to look, for example, for a rural Black woman, even though she may have been a very large part of this story. So I think that would have helped me. But, fortunately, as I said, I just knew that this was going to be an issue. So I knew how I had to think about this and how I had to do the research I needed to. And I'm sorry, what was the next question?
How do we help our students to become more critical readers of the archive?
Make them go to the archives for starters and seriously, right? Impress upon them the significance of spending time in the archives, deep and dedicated time reading the sources and not thinking about what they are reading from a 21st century perspective. Going in there with an understanding of how these people understood and navigated their world, right? And if you're looking at the archives and you're reading how people understood their world, then you can begin asking questions about what's missing from that story, right? So back to the example of African-American politics in Arkansas, I mean, if you're talking about different political organizations and goings-ons around the state, where does the Arkansas Negro Democratic Association fit within that story, for example? So it's the same sort of thing. I mean, thinking about what you see, paying close attention to what you see, and then asking the questions about what's not there, right? Understanding that Black people were never apolitical, right? I mean, their very being and resisting racist structures is political. So in what forms, in what kinds of ways did they do that?
Great, thank you. So our next question is about what this participant refers to as the crisis of the institutional archives at HBCUs across the country. And this person asked how potential losses could reverberate for generations and wonders, how can someone who develops book projects help in this and thinking about kind of creative ways to secure publications that publicize this emergency and give scholars opportunities for quick action?
Well, I'm happy to offer some thoughts, although I certainly couldn't give a definitive answer on this, but it is a great concern to me. And I'm not someone who's publishing either on the institutional history of HBCUs or related issues, but it's something that I watch. And I watch partly as someone who is very active in my professional associations and thinking about what advocacy means outside of just my comfy home at an institution on top of the hill in Fayetteville, but what do I do larger? Before I came to Fayetteville, I was in Tallahassee working for the state archives there, and we had the Florida A&M archives. And I know that they have, they've, like a lot of HBCUs, they've seen budget shortfalls and other institutional crises. And it's a great concern for me. One of the things I know from SAA, the Society of American Archivists perspective, but also from my regional organization, Society of Southwest Archivists, that we try to offer as best we can. One thing is to make sure that those issues, the concerns, the calls for help, that those are being heard at our meetings, that we are giving space to those conversations, that the institutional conversations we have are not just about the large places, the large flagship universities, or the state archives, or government record centers, or well-endowed private research institutions, but are about all of our institutions, particularly places that might be experiencing different budget situations, different staffing situations. That's all true. And we have to make sure that those conversations are lifted up. But then we also have to offer help as we can, but also just support without swooping in. And that's one thing I'll say as somebody that's at a university in the state where we do have an HBCU, that you know, it's not my job or any of our jobs here in Fayetteville to go in and do anything for Pine Bluff. It is our job to support them. And I would say that as a public employee at a public university here, it is my job to support larger policy changes that could help them. But also just to make myself available. I stay in contact with archivists across the country. One of my roles for SAA is to be in the Arkansas liaison for SAA. And so you know, when I get questions, hopefully I can help, but also hopefully I can just point people towards other resources. And again, I'm not an expert on this, so helping other people find the expertise and the assistance they need.
Would any of our other panelists like to comment on that question? All right, great. Then I think we'll finish up with this next one. I believe we've gotten to all of the questions. So this is something that has been directed at Joshua, and I think there might be others as well who maybe don't want to offer their thoughts, but we'll start with Joshua. So the person asks or describes that you spoke earlier of aspiring for objectivity in your professional practice as you engage in the cultural conversation, as well as with collection users. And this person is wondering what your thoughts are around the differences between objectivity and neutrality when dealing with matters of representation and injustice. And to what extent is it possible to practice, to act with objectivity while not being ethically or morally neutral? So there's a lot there.
Almost made it the whole time without the mute thing. So first of all, I'd like to thank the person that asked that question for both challenging my use of the word objectivity and for allowing me an opportunity to clarify. And I say challenging because objectivity is a concept in archives, but I think in a lot of information practices and institutional practices, frankly, that can get in the way of doing the right work or the important work. And so when I used objectivity, I was thinking kind of in my role, which is about half of my brain on any given day, which is as a teacher or someone who's facilitating other people's research. So I'm really trying to allow my students and also the faculty I work with and researchers off campus, allowing them the opportunity to come at the data, come at the information and make their own assessments, do their own analysis, but also trying to be objective in their analysis, to take in all of the information, to not bring their own bias to their research projects, something I work with undergraduate students and graduate students too on a daily basis about, taking in everything in order to be as critical and as analytical as you possibly can be in order to come up with the best analysis in the end and your best conclusions. So that's part of it, objectivity as a teacher. As it relates to other questions and aspects of my work and all of our work as archivists, and really anyone who's doing collection management or curation or teaching, you can't be neutral on social justice issues. And that's my take on that. And one of the things that I've done since I've been here and also at my previous places was to see every opportunity I have to work with students or to do an exhibit or to talk to donors as an opportunity to show the whole of our history, the whole of what's represented, and to give people the opportunity to see discrepancies and to see problems there. When we're thinking about things like collection history and future collection development, we have to avoid objectivity and to know that a neutral approach to it would not be correcting our problems. So as I was talking about when I first started today, the stuff that's not in our special collections at the flagship university here, that is partly because of an objective approach to collection development, I would argue, and the people taking what is coming or letting other people decide what the strengths or what I call the bias of strengths in your collection are. Well, if that's your approach, then you're not going to seek out the unheard voices. You're not going to seek the people that don't have a trusting relationship with you. You're not going to build new relationships with people that don't think that they should be represented in the historical record. And that's just not right. You'll also allow, I mean, we're a public institution that survives partly on public funding, like a lot of research institutions. You could allow other power structures or previous paradigms that have been in place for sometimes decades or centuries to dictate your actions instead of assessing, and critically looking at everything you do. So we can collect in new ways, we can reach out to new people, and we can make it very apparent that we are available to everyone. And I think that goes beyond neutrality. That is accepting the lessons of social justice, the calls to action of social justice, while still maintaining the professional objectivity that we would like in the day-to-day, minute-to-minute work that we do.
So there is actually one additional question that I skipped over that I think I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts on, and that's where we'll end this afternoon. So the person was saying that they appreciate the perspectives and experiences that each of you as panelists have brought to this conversation. And from what this person has heard, it sounds as though everyone is saying we have to think differently when understanding, collecting, relationship building when it comes to the archives. And so this person was hoping that you all might be able to suggest ways that we institutionalize the ideals that we've been talking about. And not to put anybody on the spot, but I wonder if maybe we can kind of return to the order that we had at the beginning. So Valencia, if you don't mind offering some initial thoughts. It's always hard to go first, but this is right in your wheelhouse. So I'm going to ask you to go ahead and share.
So how we can institutionalize social justice values into the day-to-day. That is a great question. It's a heavy question because I think the cultural moment that we find ourselves in, especially at my institutions, is the creation and spinning up of diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, and it's a hot thing right now. How you institutionalize that, I think when you craft policies and procedures, to always have a review period and have that baked into it. So you're constantly re-examining yourself and re-examining what you do and why you do it, is one way to do it. I think also, like, base level is to be explicit about what you're doing and to be intentional. A lot of times our biases encroach on our work. It's because we're not in the framework of, oh, I have to be aware. We're not hyper aware of what's coming in and how we're being influenced. And I think that, if we do that, it'll start the ball rolling.
Thanks so much for sharing. Stace, do you mind unmuting and sharing some final thoughts related to that question as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most fundamental things is ensuring that you are putting more people in positions of power and decision-making, creating pipelines, understanding the barriers of why, for the museum field, for example, it's been predominantly white for centuries. But understanding what those barriers are and getting people at the decision-making tables, and this goes for universities as well, but like we need to see more board members and chancellors and deans of varying backgrounds that can actually, assert a lot of these, challenge a lot of the assumptions that may have already been there. And certainly in our, we're trying to diversify our board, our leadership, and all of that. But so much more than just diversifying, it's giving actual agency and voice to those diverse voices. So really blending, making it a much more blended and robust conversation. That, just like Valencia said, is something that is continually iterative, and that you're still returning and you're questioning and you're evaluating. And so that's what I think is the best hope for, at least when you use the term institutionalizing some of these ideas, is probably start with the people.
Great, thank you. Joshua, let's head over to you next.
Sure. I think both Stace and Valencia hit on the key points from my perspective as well. One thing is, I think it comes back to thinking of institutionalization of these ideas as rebuilding the institution. And that means, as Stace pointed out, bringing in people in decision-making positions, administrative positions of power that do have different backgrounds, that are different people. It means bringing people with different voices to larger discussions. But as Valencia was saying, also baking into it this review process and not backing off of that, not thinking that, you know, I said something earlier in our conversation about reacting to this moment. But I think it's important just to not let it be reactive or not just be part of the conversation, but for it actually to be a rebuilding, a chance to rebuild in a way that actually will allow you to continually review, continually improve, not rest on the idea that, well, this is a challenging moment. And once we get this right, well, you know, now we've got it right, because we're not going to get it right. That's one of the things about being an institution. We're not going to get it right, but all we can do is just try our best and continue to review and improve what we're doing.
Great. And so Dr. Jones-Branch, we'll give you the last word here.
Thank you. I think about this from the perspective, my perspective as a university professor. And one of the things that I often think about is when you come to a university, you're coming to a place that by design should be diverse, which means you're walking into an environment where you should allow yourself to access the opportunity to learn from different kinds of people and hear different kinds of voices. I mean, by design, different people ought to be sitting at the table with diverse voices and experiences when you meet them. And I think Josh's point is spot on. The work is ongoing. I think so many people want there to be a moment at which we have all of this resolved, but that's never happened throughout the course of history. You may come to a better understanding of things. You may progress beyond certain points, but then the historical context will shift and there'll be something new. But I think as long as people are mindful of the fact that this is work that we're always going to have to do, and when we become comfortable in a certain position, we need to always be thinking about for whom is this situation uncomfortable, which of course will force you to revisit things, right? And as long as we understand that this is work that we always have to do, hopefully that will keep people from becoming complacent and understanding that social justice work, the institutionalization of social justice values is a long haul, right? It's something that we should always be doing because we'll never get it perfect. There'll always be something else.
Great, that's a really wonderful note to end on. So I want to thank each of our panelists for their time today and sharing their thoughts and their reflections on the work that we do and where we hope to go. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. There will be a recording of this event made available, and so you'll all receive that, and we'll also be posting it on our Special Collections website, so you can check for it there. And so we'll close things out here. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day.